It is Friday, November 22nd. Let's talk PlayStation. Welcome back, everyone, to another Kadokawa episode of LTPS. Before the PS Plus reminder, a very quick announcement here, but if you remember from about a year ago, I did those 3 retrospective videos on Haze, Folklore, and Lair, and a lot of you really enjoyed those. I enjoyed them too, so I'm trying to do more of them, and I'm now trying to turn that into a more formal series called PSR, a PlayStation Retrospective. I swear I came up with that well before Sony formally revealed PS5, and their AI upscaling solution was called PSSR. We're doing just one S on here, but PSR, a new episode coming out, I hope by Sunday, if not maybe Monday, Tuesday. It should be this week is what I want to put out there, and because this is like more singular about one particular game, old school, I know it's going to probably do bad initially, which that hurts the algorithm, and so it might get lost in subscription feeds. So I want to at least put it out there. Hey, PSR, the new retrospective series. We'll probably do at least 2 episodes before the year closes out, but if these do well, then I hope we are able to have this be a recurring theme or a recurring video series on the channel, because my god, it's been so fun going back and playing a lot of these games. Now, having said that, let's go into our PS Plus reminder. The essential lineup is still live on PSN, so make sure you claim those games. Also, PS Plus Extra and Premium, that lineup is now live on PSN as well, and that also means we now have, I think, 17-something games leaving the game catalog in about a month's time. So that would be Stranger of Paradise, Final Fantasy Origin. You've got multiple Mega Man games on there, 11, and then Legacy Collection 1 and 2. Judgment is going away, 2 Dead Island games. Metal Hellsinger is really cool. A lot of chaotic, fast-paced Doom-style gameplay with some heavy metal music, so you might be super into that, but you've got about a month left to play these games. Anyway, moving on to our first news story, it is Black Friday weekend, or in some cases, Black Friday week, 2 weeks, a month. Really depends on who we're talking about here, but for PlayStation, it starts today, and at the time of filming, I don't have the exact pricing details, but we do have percentages, so you can check today to see what the exact numbers are, but you should expect up to 25% off on DualSense controllers, and then PSVR 2 is up to 40% off, so great time to get PSVR 2, and then all PS5 consoles should be discounted. That includes the Fortnite bundle coming up as well. We already expect that should be a decent price decrease. And then new PS Plus memberships should be up to 30% off. Essential members that are looking to upgrade to Extra can save 25%, and then 30% if you're going to Premium or Deluxe. And then up to 40% off on the PlayStation Gear Store for select products, not all of them. And of course, a ridiculous amount of games will be on sale as well. And that is at retail and the PS Store, so there's already a ton of things live on PSN. Really, it's a great time to just grab a bunch of things, especially some of the physical stuff, since at retail, you can always price match and things like that. So there's a lot of good deals to be had this year. In other retail merchandising news, we also have YouTooz, which is that company that makes a lot of figures. I know they do a lot of other YouTube channels and things like that, but they've now got the license for PlayStation, so they're doing some figures for iconic PlayStation characters, like Astrobot, Ratchet, Kratos, and Sly Cooper. Pre-orders start on the 24th, and they're coming May and April next year. I always thought these looked pretty cool. I don't have any, and I really don't care for them too much, just given the sort of art direction for how they're a little bit too cartoony. So they're not really for me, but I know some really like these, and the Astrobot does look pretty cute. Same for Sly Cooper, so these are pretty neat. Probably some good shelf fodder. Something else we can also mention is that rumored LEGO Horizon set. It's already confirmed. Pre-orders open right now. $39.99 USD, comes out March 1st, 2025. Definitely a smaller set than the tall neck one, because this only has Aloy, Varl, a Shellwalker, and a Sawtooth, and like a few other little smaller environments, which is fine. I was hoping for like a big one, so this I might actually skip, because I just don't have that much room to be setting up a bunch of Legos, basically, which is ironic given I want a larger set, which that would take up more room. But I don't know, the smaller ones at a certain point, and I'm not even a Lego person, I just like certain properties that Lego does. So either way, we now know what that is as well. Moving on to the PlayStation Portal, it got a very important 4.0 firmware update recently, which included 5 changes on the firmware changelog, 2 of them normally being a write-off, improving usability and readability on some screens, and also improving system software stability. But it does seem like Sony addressed a problem in there sneakily, which we'll talk about the 3 changes here first that they did tell us about, that being making adjustments to the volume slider on the Portal, so now you can finally get more accurate lower sound floors on the Portal, which is good to have, and then also having access to the PlayStation Link settings, so you can adjust EQ presets or the side tone volume, also great to finally have that. But the big feature change here, or addition I should say, is PlayStation Plus Premium cloud streaming for PS Plus Premium users. So you can finally stream directly on the Portal from Sony's PS5 server blades. It's only PS5 games right now, no PS4 or PS3 stuff, but you can remotely stream those games off of Sony servers and not have to use your own personal PlayStation 5. So that's great. It is in beta, so you only have access to about 200 something games. It's a very curated catalog, which is still pretty big, but relative to the entire catalog on PS Plus, it's actually quite small, but still decent enough. We did look at this recently as well in a separate upload, which the experience so far is pretty good. I mean, I had a lot of latency. Others are saying they didn't really experience that, so depends on your own situation. I know my internet service easily exceeds the recommended minimum, so it could just be a weird fringe case because the image quality still looked fantastic on the Portal and I could hardly notice any sort of compression artifacts, but generally it looked and played very nice, especially because PS Plus saves, they were syncing automatically. I would load up a game, my file was there immediately, so it was a really good experience, and it does add a lot of utility to the Portal as well, which long term Sony keeps saying that this is their first remote play device, dedicated, I should clarify there. So very clearly we're probably going to get a version 2, 3 Portal at some point down the road. So even if you're still not sold on the Portal right now, in theory it could get a lot better over time as they start to establish the streaming capabilities for the Portal itself. Now, the thing that they fixed without even acknowledging this problem ever is the micro stutter. It does appear as though they finally fixed this, which if you've heard about this problem before, a lot of people don't even notice it, which is a good thing, obviously, if you never really noticed it or ran into it. But it's basically a frame rate mismatch, a very minor frame rate, 59 hertz refresh rate that's being sent between the the console to the Portal's display, and so it does create like a 1 frame drop every so often, to where some folks can notice it, especially if you are playing very fast-paced kinetic games, which that's the problem. So it would appear as though they did fix this in the recent firmware. That, and also probably increasing the bitrate on the device as well. It sounds like this was a much needed update, and it does add, again, more utility to the Portal. And if you're not sold on Gen 1, you got to think Gen 2, Gen 3 will look a lot better. I really want them to invest in some sort of proprietary onboard connection if you are planning to use the Portal within your home network, and just get that latency down even further. If you do that, I think people will sort of overlook the idea that like, oh, you're not really playing the games locally, if there is something in place that brings that latency down to the absolute minimum. Moving on to a very big rumor that came up earlier this week, which was enough to prompt a breaking news story upload, and now we can say it's no longer a rumor. There is some validity to it, because initially this was reported on by Reuters that Sony was looking to acquire Kadokawa, the primary stakeholder and parent company of From Software, and they also own Spike Chunsoft, Acquire. They've also got a very big presence in the anime and manga publishing segment, and so there is a lot of upside and alignment that works with Sony. We know why they would want to do it, but we did discuss in that conversation that in terms of acquisition rumors, even though there are 2 sources close to the matter and it's a legacy publication putting this news story out there, we should still tread lightly on this. But From Software has now, or rather Kadokawa has now confirmed the reports and the suspicions. They sent out this statement where they mentioned the company has received an initial letter of intent from Sony to acquire the company shares, and they also mentioned that no decision has been made at this time. Now, this is a huge deal, because a letter of intent is not necessarily something where it's like, oh, this is the first pass and now negotiations begin. the implication here is that they are well into the advanced stages of negotiation. So there's already been, you would expect a meaningful amount of back and forth as far as looking at company financials, doing some initial due diligence, establishing the mutual upside between both organizations, and maybe even agreeing upon it in some manner initially. It's not binding, so that's not to say it's going to happen for sure, but they are probably well into this this discussion, and they probably felt that pressure to put out this report because they maybe were a bit blindsided by this whole thing, because we don't normally get acquisition rumors like this that have some credibility. That, and also acknowledging the influence that this report initially had on the share price of these companies as well. So Kadokawa went up, Sony went up, I think, and then Bandai Namco took a hit. So it's like there's some initial speculation on the share price. So they probably wanted to get that out there right away. But this is big news because it does mean that they are far along enough to where this might actually happen in the coming weeks. So we could have a scenario where Kadokawa does become under the Sony Group ownership. And as we discussed in the recent upload, there's a lot of implications for how they could manage these studios. The most natural thing is From Software goes under SIE, and all the anime and manga stuff will go under Aniplex and Sony Music. But the other studios, who knows? Also, are they going to buy out the rest of these shares from Tencent? How are they going to manage From Software? There's always a lot of fear and uncertainty with a new story like this, and you can see it in other camps and threads and comment sections, which is Sony shouldn't be touching From Software or something, but that's also the unfamiliarity of how Sony manages studios. So I can't expect that they'd be in a situation where they're going to control From or make sure that they do X, Y, and Z things, or make them do remasters or something. We all know that's not really how it would go necessarily for how Sony does business. So there are some, I think, predictable things we could see play out if Kadokawa does get brought in and they bring From Software under SIE and PlayStation Studios. But it's still something where it's uncharted territory with what was still a primary third-party developer and studio that was always shipping on a lot of different platforms, despite having some deep PlayStation lineage and shipping a lot of PlayStation-only games, which again goes into semantics in the grand scheme of things. But a From Software nowadays that ships on everything, and Elden Ring being a big cultural phenomenon, despite having done Demon's Souls or Diracine or Bloodborne, it's just enough time has passed to where if they do another exclusive, it would not go over nearly as well. So we don't really know how they would approach that. So there's so many ways this can end up, and to digest the whole company, and there's of course regulatory scrutiny that might end up happening. I have seen some bring up this argument of how Kadokawa is in this position where there's like a hostile takeover that they want to possibly avoid, and Japan just wants to keep Japanese companies very Japanese. So that would explain why maybe Japan would have no problem approving this, but Western regulatory approval would be potentially a lot different. But it's just, there's a lot to digest here, so we'll have to wait and see, as we like to say. But with this one, we might not have to wait too long to get a result on this, because it sounds like something might actually be brewing here, and we might have a scenario where Sony Interactive owns From Software. All right, let's move on to some PS5 Pro news and updates, starting off with the PS5 Pro sales. We don't have new numbers here, but we do have another indicator, another lick of evidence implying that PS5 Pro is doing about as well as PS4 Pro. So in the US, from Matt Piscatella of Circana, we know that PS5 Pro had a solid start during its launch week, with units in the same ballpark as the PS4 Pro's launch. So not well over, not well under, just, hey, the low volume console is doing the same as the other low volume console that we can benchmark and compare it to. Just the obvious issue with PS5 Pro this time around is it is the most expensive console we've ever had. Even when you adjust for inflation, there's just no getting around a $699 console being very expensive, or for some, if you play with discs, it's mandatory that it's actually upwards of $800, and in some markets it's over $1,000. It's a lot of money, we all know that, but it does still seem to be in that same ballpark, which is a low volume machine that does speak to a certain customer base, and people are buying it in the same manner that they were as PlayStation 4 Pro. Now, moving on to some new patches for PS5 Pro games, which at this point we should just clarify that we're not going to be doing this every week because at a certain point it's just going to be unsustainable with how often games come out, and a lot of titles are just going to naturally have PS5 Pro support. But it is still noteworthy that we are actually getting some 8K games. I really did not expect this many, which it's still not a lot, but it's more than I thought. So we have the Callisto Protocol got a PS5 Pro patch. You can play that in performance mode with full ray tracing, and that's 4K 60 FPS, but there is also an 8K 30 FPS mode, which Callisto Protocol looks, that's a ridiculous looking game. It's one of the sort of true next-gen looking titles. And then Redacted also has new modes for 4K 120 or 8K 60, which in terms of the art style for that game, you know, we're probably going to see a number of titles that can easily hit 8K or with PSSR implementation, do 8K with 30 or 60 FPS. You're probably going to see a number of these titles throughout the life cycle, but we do have that. Should also quickly mention that Assassin's Creed Syndicate got a 60 FPS patch recently as well. That's for base consoles and PS5 Pro as well. That game, it was always so interesting because it was broken on PS5 for a long time. Then they fixed it, but it was still locked at 30, although I think if you played the game unpatched on a regular PS5, it was 60, but it was still broken for the longest time. Now it's fixed, but you would need the latest patch, which then locks it to 30, so now it's unlocked to 60. So there's that. But yeah, going back to 8K, it's still very much a novelty kind of thing. I would assume most of you don't have 8K televisions. I certainly don't. A lot of people don't. And there's arguments to be made that 8K is never really going to take off in the same sort of meaningful manner that 4K did, especially when at a certain point you need a display size that is so large most homes won't fit that. And it's also in relation to your viewing distance. So it's a novelty in the here and now. But I want to give credit where it's due. I really didn't think we would be seeing this many 8K games. It's up to like 4 or 5 now, and I thought maybe 1 or 2. So look, it ain't much, and it's really easy to clown on it in the here and now, but that's the thing with us being like in present day. It's funny to look, point, and laugh, but then 10, 20 years later, you're going to have a YouTube video talking about how, did you know the PS5 Pro actually had 8K games? And everyone goes, oh, that's cool, right? Like, so it's important to understand that it's present day, and that's why it's easy to laugh at it. But by God, I'm actually surprised that we're seeing a number of them, and I think that's cool. In other PS5 Pro news, we also have some growing pains popping up as well, which, depending on how the studio has used PSSR, what modes they are or are not offering on the Pro now, that means you might actually have a worse experience on the Pro versus the base console. So we have 2 big examples from this past week, Star Wars Jedi Survivor and Silent Hill 2. So for Star Wars, the PS5 Pro patch added RT reflections, but the PSSR implementation has created a range of visual issues that make the game look worse than the base console's performance mode, which EA has already acknowledged the issues on Twitter, and they are looking into it. Silent Hill 2 has some bizarre shimmering issues when played on Pro, with more visual noise and instabilities and motion. Now, Bloober Team also acknowledged the issues on Twitter as well, so they are also looking into it. But, shortly after all this, we had a thread pop up on Recent Era discussing the issues with Jedi Survivor, and the developer behind the recently released game Albatross, they gave some insight into what might be going on with PSSR, and so they mentioned that Jedi Survivor is a UE4 game on SDK 9, so it would be an earlier version of PSSR, maybe even the first one, because there's already been multiple versions of PSSR, and the most recent one is on UE 5.5. They even say that for the second and third batches of Pro titles using PSSR, you should expect more image quality improvements, where it could get a lot better, and I think that's the natural expectation, is that in 2-3 years an AI upscaling solution is going to get better, so not exactly a big surprise there. But yeah, with Jedi Survivor, I mean, that makes sense. It is a UE4 game, but we have other UE4 examples that look fantastic. So it might be a combination of the game's, let's say, base internal resolution, because Jedi Survivor is like really low, and also mixing that with a very early iteration of PSSR, and you're getting just these really ugly results. and who knows what's going on with Silent Hill 2. It's really strange. You got to expect that you're going to have this come with the territory for the first round of titles that are on PlayStation 5 Pro. I can't exactly remember if that was the case for PS4 Pro. I'm sure there was a fringe case there, maybe one or two titles that had just some issues initially, and so they got to get cleaned up. But, there are definitely those growing pains that are happening right now. Like, the one aspect that people aren't really enjoying about Pro is that in some cases, like, they just mess with the settings to where when you're playing on Pro, you can only play on the Pro setting and you can't access the older performance settings. And in times like this, you want to be able to choose the older versions so that maybe you can just sort of avoid an ugly experience. Some are saying that they don't enjoy having like 5 or 6 different settings, and they enjoy having this sort of initial Pro setting, and then they can just go back to 1 or 2 modes previously, or Pro Fidelity, Pro Performance. I mean, that's what we were saying earlier. This is really going to run the gamut as far as like what developers can and maybe shouldn't do, right? I mean, I know Sony has sort of best practices that they've outlined to studios, but it's still something where they have the agency with what they want to do with their games. So there are going to be times where you're just going to have a patch that maybe isn't really what you wanted. But when we're talking about a very expensive pro enthusiast style console, you want to make sure that every game that you're playing, it is going to be better than that base console. That is what you're buying into. So not a good look, but let's hope that this is just kind of a problem that's reserved to the initial run of titles, and it will get much better with some of those later experiences. Because a lot of what buying PS5 Pro today means is that you are buying the promise that every game you play on it thereafter will be the best console experience you can possibly get. And not having that happen for some titles is... well, it's not good. Moving on to a PlayStation 6 rumor and also a possible PlayStation handheld, because again, we are at that point in the console lifecycle where we are going to get this happening more and more and more. We've already had a few now at this point, and so this past week we had a new one from the Chinese forum Chapel, where a well-known hardware leaker, apparently they've been very reliable in the past, they claim Sony's next-generation console will use AMD's UDNA GPU architecture. So after RDNA 4, the naming convention is moving to UDNA, which would be used to power PlayStation 6 and also AMD's RX 9000 series. CPU-wise, the console is expected to use either Zen 4 or Zen 5, but this is a decision that Sony has not locked down just yet. And they also mentioned Sony's handheld will use AMD hardware, whereas Microsoft's handhelds are deciding between Qualcomm and AMD. So a little insight there into the possible hardware roadmap and the supply chain, because that's where this information almost always comes from, is the supply chain and hearing about this stuff, at least for consoles 3-4 years early potentially. But the thing is, we might not really have to wait that long. I mean, it'll be a decent amount of time, but if we see that AMD can verify this information by announcing the naming convention change from what we thought was RDNA 5 to UDNA, which they're going to ship those GPUs expected in like the second quarter of 2026, then we can look at this and go, okay, it seems like there's some weight to it. Because it's still early enough to where, like, yeah, there are certain decisions that are not locked in just yet, that being, as they say, Zen 4 or Zen 5. We would like the console to be nice and beefy, so potentially Sony will choose Zen 5, but they also have to be mindful of pricing, which is still a very important thing in the console business. But the thing is, PS6, okay, we know they're going to do a PlayStation 6 in theory. It's going to be powered by AMD, probably, which was the one other rumor we had, is that they were still, shopping around and getting pricing from different suppliers, and so they humored the idea of going with somebody else, but AMD probably won the contract there. That's not all too surprising, but there's still been some rumors, but not enough weight relating to another PlayStation handheld that has local play attached to it, which would be a lot more expensive than, say, the Portal, but there's a lot of upside to potentially, developing games in a manner now that are similar to the portable PCs, and that you're just playing them at a different setting that is, one SKU. You buy the game once, but it's playable on a PlayStation 6 or also this new PlayStation handheld. So that would be great. I would love to see that be the direction that the company takes for offering a portable console, especially one that could also, in theory, play your back catalog of things that you own on PSN. So there's not much we can really speculate beyond what we just heard, so we'll just leave it there for now. But those PS6 rumors are probably going to ramp up more and more as we go into 2025. Let's move on to some news for Final Fantasy VII Remake Part 3, because that is also a topic where we're close enough to finally get more info about this game, and so that's what we're hearing out of G-Star 2024, where the game's director, Naoki Hamaguchi, talked about how with the airship and the third entry, they're not going to cheat with the high wind. So they're expecting, in the third game, you're going to be able to get in the high wind and fly that around, and so they're just talking about how they want to take on the challenge of really letting you fly from a high perspective freely around the map. They're just more or less outlining that they're not going to do any sort of tricks or cheats. You're going to be able to fly that thing as one would expect around the map, which I think is nice to hear this early. We also learned from a conversation with the Daily Star that, again, Hamaguchi confirmed there is not going to be any DLC for Rebirth, and that they're looking to get the third game out as quickly as possible, which at this point the team is also letting people know that the plot and concept is already completed and development is well underway. Now, there was a 4-year gap from Remake to Rebirth, but that also included the Integrate DLC that a portion of the team spent working on, so it almost reads to me like maybe they want to get this game out the door in 3 years rather than 4, which that would be good. I mean, it would be a pleasant surprise, and I think they are set up in a position to maybe do that, with Rebirth already establishing so many aspects of what the third game is going to have, being the world and towns and places to visit and, X, Y, and Z things. They've already got a lot laid out. So, I mean, I think it would be reasonable to say that the third game is going to come sooner than people think, although it also reads to me like there's maybe a bit of corporate pressure from Square to just get the game out, because Rebirth clearly didn't do what the company was expecting, and maybe there's also just that, like a slight hint of, if you get the game out sooner, there is more upside for us being able to monetize it further, and that could be repackaging all 3 games. That could also be shipping on other platforms if they do have some kind of agreement with SIE that is determined based on the amount of time that the last game finally is out there. We still don't know, like, the conditions of whatever agreement they did have with Sony, although it's clear they amended it to some degree, because with Remake, the first entry, there was already an exclusive window placed on that game, which then at a certain point the PC version came out, but we still just don't know exactly what can or cannot happen with other console releases. But if it is based on time, then they're going to want to get the game out sooner to be able to release elsewhere. So that's kind of what I'm picking up from what they're laying down, but I hope there's not that pressure to ship the game fast and instead make sure the game is done right. Let's hope that's what's going on. Next up, we have another business shakeup going on at SIE with the PlayStation Studios mobile division, which has so far not shipped a game under that label at all, and they've also closed down a studio, so it seems like they still have problems getting this thing off the ground. But we have a new head of PS Mobile, and that is Olivier Coutamoche, which he previously was the co-head next to Chris Davis. This was all confirmed on LinkedIn, which Chris still has the co-head role listed on his LinkedIn, but Olivier now is the proper head, so it seems like he just moved up to take on the entire role. And then also Justin Kubiak is the head of mobile business development and partnerships. So that's where we are there. There's really not much to say, because they've both got experience at different studios and mobile and things like that. So it's still a lot of the proper talent seeking that Sony has done with establishing this particular arm of SIE, but we just still haven't seen anything, and it would appear as though they're further away than they were with Neon Koi, so I still would love to see where they go with this, but it's been collectively probably a bit of a hassle behind the scenes, with just maybe a lot of conflicting ideas and company culture of what they should or want to do. You got to figure that's probably what's going on, with a few years going by now at this point and not much to show for it. Moving on to Jeff Keighley's The Game Awards, the de facto Game of the Year ceremony, which I do say with sarcasm, because as I remind people every year, that is not the only ceremony that takes place. There are 200-something places that will do this, and so your favorite game always has a shot somewhere else, even though, yes, it's the biggest one that has the most flair and excitement and advertising, which is also a key element of the show, and it's a highly publicized thing, which I get why that's the one people talk the most about. But that is also the topic of discussion, because there has been some controversy surrounding the nominees this year, because right before they were confirmed, a few days prior, the official site published this as on the FAQ, where they clarified this information. They say, and I quote here, "The Game Awards aims to recognize the best creative and technical work each year, irrespective of the format of that content's release. Expansion packs, new game seasons, DLCs, remakes, and remasters are eligible in all categories if the jury deems the new creative and technical work to be worthy of a nomination." Now, the jury was aware of this, and the jury, the panel here being, 100 plus media organizations, both legacy, some new ones in there as well, some YouTube channels, not many, but it's just a big panel of those in the critical field. And so they were aware of this information, and so the resulting nominees are Astrobot, Balatro, Black Myth Wukong, Elden Ring, Shadow of the Erdtree, Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, and Metaphor Refantasio. So the issue here is slightly twofold. Some people that are completely unreasonable are acting like Balatro shouldn't be on there or shouldn't win. I don't know why we're still humoring this conversation. Games big and small should be up for that award. Really does not matter. That stigma might have held some ground 15, 20 something years ago, and it kind of always has, obviously, because those games tend to not show up as nominees, or they end up winning the actual overall Game of the Year award. I would be perfectly fine with Balatro winning this year, because it is an incredible game, and at the end of the day, if you pour hours into a game and you love it and you always go back to it, I mean, God forbid, is that not what the whole point of the award is for? Having said that, I think you are not being reasonable, and you're not really worth humoring if you really think that. So that's kind of not even so much a thing. But there has been some genuine talk surrounding Shadow of the Erdtree, a DLC which is required for, well, the base game is required, and I believe you need to get to near end game to access it. And so there's the argument being made of why not make a separate category, best DLC, and that will accommodate this scenario, especially because, as many are keenly pointing out, why was this not the language in years prior, recent years prior, for Xenoblade Chronicles 3 Future Redeemed or Phantom Liberty? That's why we have Best Racer, Best RPG, Best Accessibility options. We can make new categories to accommodate certain cases, but this is the problem, is that anytime there is going to be a change, there's going to be pushback, because it's changing the language of what we expected before. And so usually there's going to be a lot of pushback, and oftentimes it won't necessarily be something where it's I'm happy they're making this change, right? Especially for Game of the Year, where almost always this is going to cause a lot of issues or arguing or, back and forth talk about what should have been there, what should not have been on there. Because already it's okay, why not Silent Hill 2 Remake? Why not Persona 3 Reload? How did Helldivers 2 not make it on there when that game was taking over the world for 2.5 months or something? So, and I'm with you. I thought Helldivers 2 maybe would have been on there. Some people feel like Erdtree should not be there by merit of it being DLC and being, locked to another game, another piece of content, and so something else should be there. Now, I'm personally of the mind of, I'm more in agreement of maybe it shouldn't be there. I mean, there has to be distinctions, important distinctions, fine lines on what does and does not get considered for that category and other categories. There has to be very specific language, and the language they gave is actually very broad. But it's broad in a sense that okay, now we know moving forward, everything can be considered if it, as they say, is the best creative, technical work each year, irrespective of the format of that content's release. And so, with that language, I will say that is good. We now know what's considered, which anything is on the table. My problem is that, I think DLC, if it's tied to the base game and it's end game, that's to a point where I'm not fully on board with that. Also remasters. They said remasters as well. Remasters, pound for pound, are almost always the original work, just with a frame rate and resolution bump on a new console. It's ported over. If we're saying that can be Game of the Year, that I would argue is way more problematic than a DLC ever winning. And if somehow a remaster wins, I don't know how that happens. It must be a very bad year for games. But I would say that doesn't really make sense. Remakes are a different fringe case, considering the original work has a new interpretation and it's updated for a modern audience, and that's how you have examples like Persona 3 Reload or Silent Hill 2 Remake, being the first time somebody played those games, and even returning fans enjoying the changes that were done with that creative work, even though a lot of it foundationally was established 10, 20 something years ago. But that's where we have to start drawing lines, right? Like what can and cannot be considered. So I'm not really in favor of it, but it's something where if they're going to change it, yeah, there's going to be pushback, but at least now we have some clear, direct language. There's always going to be inconsistencies regarding why did they do this thing one year versus the other, and that's going to be the case for not just Game of the Year awards, or Jeff Keighley's event, I should say, but every other publication, because that's just how this always works. Nobody's ever going to be happy with Game of the Year, especially when some feel like their work should have been on there. Why is the Erdtree there when it could have been Stellar Blade or Warhammer or Infinite Wealth, games that maybe were not going to show up there. But it's all based on the panel and what they tend to submit, and so there's that to consider as well. Look, I'll just say this. Astrobot, it's on there. I'm very happy. I thought, it's probably going to get nominated. I don't know if it'll win. I don't really think it will. I would love to be wrong about that, though. I think it'll pick up a few if we're talking about the 200 plus publications that will run their own awards. But for this particular event, I'm not so sure it'll get it. That, and also, actually Fantasio. I can't even really speak on that game. There's a lot of these titles that I still haven't really spent a lot of time with, so don't listen to me. I would think the favorite here is either Rebirth, Balatro, Erdtree. Erdtree does clearly have a good shot because they felt the need to put this out there at the very minimum. If Erdtree can sort of be the singular content that made them change the language surrounding this to accommodate the game, or the content rather, being up for consideration, that heavily implies that it is a favorite to win. So strap yourselves in for the distinct possibility that it does win. And it's still good content. It's obviously good. I think everybody can probably agree on that. Just this is the year where that's now the changed language surrounding what can be considered. So it is what it is, right? Sometimes things change, and all I'll say is Astrobot Supremacy is strong and alive for the end of this year. But generally, Game of the Year is the kind of topic that's going to cause some issues, and this year is no different. Now, with all that said, it is time for Let's Talk Plus, the weekly Let's Talk PlayStation giveaway, where one of you can win a $10 PSN code. I would like to congratulate this viewer right here. I'll be contacting you very soon via email or X, and if you would like to win a $10 PSN code, it is so simple. You can follow the link down below, enter the Gleam giveaway, and supporting this channel a number of ways can get you an entry, and I'll announce the winner next week, because I'm trying to help pay for your games. Those were all the stories from this past week that I wanted to talk about with you all, and we were again very busy. We had the speedrun Astrobot levels, very fun diving into those. We had the Kadokawa acquisition rumor, and we also had the PlayStation Portal 4.0 update with the PS Plus Cloud streaming beta. And then coming up, we have, again, like I said, the first new episode of PSR, a PlayStation retrospective. It will be 50 Cent Blood on the Sand. That game is ridiculous. Trust me, you'll want to check that out. We also have the 30th anniversary accessories finally coming in. I'll probably just do a group unboxing of some of the things I picked up. I did not get a Portal or, again, the serialized 30th anniversary PS5 Pro, but I got everything else, and so I will be taking those out of the box, which will be very fun. And then also just PS5 Pro impressions. I'll probably have those up finally as well, just going over the entire aspect of the console in these first 2 weeks thus far. But that is pretty much it. So that concludes this week's episode of Let's Talk PlayStation. I'm Ryan Benecki. Thank you all so much for talking with me, and I will see you all next Friday.